Welcome to Moving Conversations, a podcast for movement professionals by movement professionals. If you coach, train, or teach movement, Pilates, or fitness, then this podcast is for you. With more than 60 years of experience in fitness and Pilates, your hosts Brian Ritchie and Nora St. John explore the science of human movement, diving deep into the facts, myths, and common misconceptions, hoping to spark thought and conversation about how we view fitness and movement. Now, let's jump into Moving Conversations. And welcome back to Moving Conversations. I'm Brian Ritchie. Joining me as always is Nora St. John. Good morning, Nora. How are you this morning?
Very well, Brian, and how are you?
I'm doing good. I just got back from Korea and my body has no idea what time zone it is, what day it is. I have no clue whatsoever. I'm just sort of floating through life. Yesterday I fell asleep middle of the afternoon, flat on my face. I was like, oh, I'm exhausted. So hopefully by the end of the weekend, everything will be back to normal and I'll be 100%.
During kimchi time. We call it kimchi time.
Kimchi time. I love that. Yes. And that's, it's the only negative about going that far away from home to teach. Mm-hmm. You know, you get there and you have all the adrenaline that keeps you going and you're on top of everything. And then when you come home, the adrenaline fades away and you get back into your normal routine and then everything hits. Yeah. So hopefully my brain won't be on pause today and we'll be able to get through this. I'm excited. Last time we recorded, we did part 1 of the Troublesome Triad. So today we're going to hit part 2. But before we even get into the piriformis, which is the third part of the terrible triad, I wanted to talk with you a little bit about spasms. Last episode, we talked about it briefly. So I wanted to get into it a little bit more. Let's get into detail because I find that that's a topic that when people mention it, it's kind of like, oh, is it a sprain? Is it a strain? Did I do this? Did I pull the muscle? Did I strain? All that kind of stuff. It's the same with a spasm. They say it like they know what it is, but if you ask them, they don't really know. So we're going to get started on that. But before we do me a favor, guys. If you like what you guys are hearing, please hit the subscribe button. Check us out on our socials, Moving Convos on Instagram as well as Twitter. We're also on YouTube at Moving Convos. You can also reach me at Fit for Life DC. That's with the number 4 on Instagram. Do you want to promote your socials, if you remember them?
I think it's Nora.s.john.7.
I was going to say.
Both Facebook and Instagram.
Yeah. Also, on Gmail, movingconvos@gmail.com. If you have any questions, comments, or you want to reach out to us and say, hey, or have a suggestion for the future, do that. All right. So now let's get into this. Let's get into back spasms or spasms in general, muscle spasms.
All right, so last time we talked about the psoas and the quadratus lumborum, and I mentioned in passing a bit that a common problem with the troublesome triad is what I call these muscle spasms. So let's talk about what muscle spasms are in a little bit more detail. They tend to happen in muscles that are multi-joint, that have a lot of different inputs into them, and that are necessary for ongoing postural support. Right, so that's why it's, in this case, the psoas major, the quadratus lumborum, and the piriformis. So what happens to those muscles is, or this is one way to think about a spasm, is they're under a constant state of tone, a certain amount of tone, and not necessarily a large dynamic range of tone, right? They're just like holding on at a certain level to keep you upright, to keep the body parts oriented, whether it's hip stability or lumbar-pelvic stability or whatever other situation's going on. What happens sometimes is when muscles are required to do more than they are able to do in terms of their actual ATP, energetic processes, in terms of their actual strength and energy requirements, they will tend to tighten up. Actually, 2 things happen. 1, they will tend to just tighten up to hold things together. 2, within muscles, what will happen over time, especially postural muscles, is if they are not, by their inherent strength and flexibility, able to support the job they need to do, they will increase the amount of fascial tissue or connective tissue within the muscle. All right. So muscle fibers and muscle tissue itself is pretty well innervated, has a lot of good blood supply, right? It's a very active, lively tissue. Fascial tissue, collagen fibers, the connective tissue is not so much. It's more just like fibers. So it just hangs out in there and helps to reinforce the structure. So what happens a lot of times with something like the piriformis or quadratus lumborum or the psoas or other areas is the body will start to lay down this fascia over time.
Okay.
That fascia will replace some of the muscle fibers, making the tissue less well nourished in terms of blood supply. So when that happens, what'll happen is that the muscles will tend to tighten up in order to, again, hold that position they need to hold for long periods of time. Think of sitting, which many of you are probably doing now. And in that process, it will start to clamp down on its own blood supply. Its capillary bed will inhibit its own capillary bed slightly. And that decreases the amount of blood going into the tissues, which decreases the amount of oxygen, leading to ischemia, or just loss of blood is what ischemia is basically, which leads to a drop in pH. This is one of those like bad cycles. A drop in pH, which leads to an increase in nociception, which is pain reception, or pain perception, I should say, which leads to an increase in excitability of the muscle, meaning it wants to tighten up even more, and that cycle just repeats itself. So that's the physiology, if you will, of a muscle spasm. That muscle gets a little bit tight, it cuts off its own blood supply, that decreases the pH in the area, that increases pain sensitivity, that increases excitability, that leads to more spasms, more basically muscle contraction.
So it's a downward spiral. It's not just a circle. It's a downward spiral. It leads to more, it leads to more, it leads to more, rather than just going in a circle.
Right. And Brad, I know you've had muscle spasms over the time, as have I. And I have to say, once they get in that habit, trying to get them out of that habit, for me, takes relatively constant maintenance.
And that's what I'm actually going through right now. Last year, trying yoga, I had never really tried it, but everybody kept talking about it. So I was like, all right, let's give it a try. What the heck? And I did it. My first 3 or 4 sessions, just very basic, went well. I tried just a little bit more, and I was doing a warrior pose, and I leaned into it. And I said, wow, this used to throw my back out because I have 2 herniated discs. And immediately when I came back up, everything clamped down, and I could barely breathe. And I thought, oh no. And that had basically, I've been at it about 18 months. And it was really bad for about 8 or 9 weeks. And then it calms down a little bit, but it's persistent. It's always there in a slight state. I'll have 2 or 3 days of feeling fine, and then a day of, or a week of feeling not good, and then a week of feeling pretty good. And like you said, it's constant. It's something that, once it's there, you feel it. And it just continues for a period of time. And right now, because I've been traveling a lot, I've got something going on, and it's in the QL, it's in the erectors both. And you and I were talking about this before, and what I did not know about spasms. My mindset was always that a spasm was one of those things where you reach and all of a sudden it grabs you, catches your breath, and then, it lightens up. Okay, I can move again. That's how my brain was always sort of thought of as spasms. But what you brought up and what really enlightened me was that it's more persistent. And this ultra tight muscle that I kept thinking, wow, I'm just muscle super tight. That's actually sort of a spasm that's not really letting up. And that has really enlightened me into, okay, I have to treat this as a spasm and not just a tightness of muscle.
Right. It is a chronic low-level spasm, right, as opposed to an acute spasm. An acute spasm, many of you may be familiar with you or your clients, where again, the classic is you wake up or you lean down to pick something up and something grabs and you can't straighten up or you can't move your head or whatever it is. That's kind of the classic acute spasm, but oftentimes underlying that is this more chronic situation.
Yep.
Right? Where basically that muscle is just slightly clamped down and is kind of overexcitable. Remember? Like that idea of overexcitability. It's just ready to kind of spasm or crunch a little bit more than the other muscles are, because it's just a little bit ischemic. And the main theory on that, of how to work with that, is number one, you've got to kind of release some of that tension. So there's some mobility work that has to happen, whether that's manual therapy or whether that's myofascial release work, or whether that's just a lot of flexibility training and mobility training over time. And the second thing is really working on, I think of it as really actively strengthening that muscle through a full dynamic range to increase the amount of muscle tissue in there, to really get the muscle tissue active and lively and increase the blood flow into that area. So those two pieces are essential to, over time, resolve a spasm. But to your point, and in my experience, spasms can be very persistent in exactly the way that you're talking about.
And it's interesting that you mentioned strengthening in full range of motion, because we go into protective mode. Our bodies, and that's part of that downward spiral, is that it hurts for me to do that. So you know what? I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to limit my range of motion. And now I'm not going to rotate. I'm not going to bend. I'm going to stay nice and still and almost overstabilize the area. And we talk about stability a lot, because stability is important. But in a spastic state, your body is overstabilized, and we need to increase that range of motion. And once you get some of that range of motion going, because right now I can tell you that for me, I've got the range of motion. It hurts when I'm at the end ranges. I feel it. But, you know, my brain is immediately saying, oh, don't do too much. Don't do too much. Back off, back off. Whereas another part of my brain, the intuitive side, is basically telling me, look, you got to get stronger. We have to work this to get stronger, but don't go too far, too fast, too hard, too, heavy, all of that sort of thing. So there's a fine balance that has to be.
Very fine balance.
And it's a hair's width balance. You're really on that razor's edge, because you can go over very easy, and then all of a sudden, my back hurts for 3-4 days, and I got to get it to calm down again. But if you don't do enough, then it's going to hurt as well, just not as much. So it's a fine balance.
It's a very fine balance. And talking about the piriformis, that's been one of my bugaboos for a long time. In training the piriformis, for example, I have found, and just like you're speaking to, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Or sometimes it's 2 steps forward, 4 steps back. And it's like finding that edge of how to strengthen it without irritating it is a fine art, and one that is not always successful, right? So we talked about that in terms of the QL or in terms of the psoas. It's the same for all of them. That oftentimes, if that area is prone to spasm, you want to work it, and you want to work it dynamically, right? In other words, you want to really work it through as much of its full range as you can, as you have access to, and as that they can tolerate. But I start with that motion being assisted. Right? Meaning that I don't even have gravity resistance. Like almost like they're just kind of falling over. Let's say it's the piriformis, just opening, like lying on your back, feet on the floor, knees bent, and just opening the leg and closing the leg. So basically you are passively letting gravity take the leg into external rotation, which is activating some of the piriformis, and then bringing it back. Right? Just a passive kind of moving the area through its range of motion without much resistance.
And what's interesting is almost everybody is like, oh, I should put a band around my knees. They want to go immediately into the resistance aspect and do that supine clam, but doing it without and just working that range of motion is a much smarter way to start.
I just find I have to start so far back. If you think about the progression regression cycle, I've got to start at the beginning. I've got to start with movement, with as little resistance as possible from gravity or from external forces or from bands or from anything else. And basically, I've got to do that enough to really let things get a little bit stronger. And then I slowly will add a tiny bit of resistance, and then a tiny bit more, and then a tiny bit more. And I also have to combine that with release work. Right? So in this case, it might be my typical one for the piriformis is taking something like either a roller, or like a 5-inch ball, or as things get, if I want to work a little deeper, more like a pinky ball, right? A little hard ball or a tennis ball, and really massaging around the hip, all the way up along the sacrum, along the iliac crest, and really working that whole area regularly. Because that's the other thing is I've always got to do the strengthening and the release work in conjunction with each other.
And if you're thinking about the low back, like the quadratus lumborum, something even just like pelvic tilts, where you're lying on your back, even before the cat and cow, just getting that pelvic tilt going, getting your abdominals engaged, reminding them, hey, you got to work here too. But stretching that back out, then you can progress to cat and cow, or even just rocking forward and back, taking it through that full range of motion.
Yep. And then thinking about side bending, right? Because a QL is going to get more dynamic range with something like a side bend, but maybe I start seated and just gently tipping from side to side. So gravity is actually sort of assisting one side and then eccentrically supporting on the opposite side, right? But just trying to get that range going, or even just, supine, kind of wiggling your hips, like lying on your back and just lifting one hip up, other hip up, even along the ground, not even lifting them up. I don't mean up forward. I mean like bring your hip towards your rib cage, right? Like you're doing a little salsa motion or something. Again, just to get some stimulation in that area without gravity, without resistance, and just getting the mobility back. And that's a nice way to get some blood flow in there to decrease that ischemia and hopefully over time decrease that excitability.
It's interesting that you said sometimes it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I've got a client who was complaining about that, and I said, look, life is never always forward. I said, life is a cha-cha. It's 2 steps forward, 1 back, 2 forward, 1 back. And she looked at me, she goes, I love that. And I said, it's a dance. Just think of it as a cha-cha. You're gonna eventually get all the way forward, but understand you're gonna come back a couple times too.
I love that. And that right there is the story of what we do when we're working rehabilitatively, right? When we're trying to really get somebody out of a difficult situation or really help them to recover some function is when I'm trying to think now through my many case studies, if it's ever been a straight line.
No, it's
maybe,
rare.
Maybe every now and then, but it's not the norm. And that is the hardest thing for clients.
It's the hardest thing because they come to us expecting the magic wand.
Yeah, exactly.
And occasionally, I had a client this morning. He's had a shoulder problem for a year and he just wanted to focus on his golf game. So I just said, okay, we did light work with it, but it was getting progressively worse. So finally I said, forget it. Season's almost over. We're just going to focus on your shoulder. And I did 1 session, a little bit of body work, release work, strengthening, all ranges of motion, did a little bit of, a little bit more aggressive body work than, he'd had in the past. He came in today and he said, it's a miracle. I have no pain. I slept on the shoulder the other night and all this kind of stuff. And I'm thinking, great, awesome. Don't get used to it. Because you're going to do something silly that's going to, and he kept testing it. He said, so what was making it hurt?
Classic.
And I said, stop poking the bruise. Stop testing it. Allow the fact that it feels good today. I said it may not tomorrow, so just allow the fact that it feels good today. And we worked on it again today, and he walked out saying, I feel great. Occasionally, it'll be that straight line. But 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100, you're going to have those setbacks. And I mean, you and I have experienced it with our own bodies where, we're making good progress. Then all of a sudden, one day you wake up and you're like, what did I do?
Yeah.
Why is it hurting today? Or you'll do something silly like I did. I was doing awesome, which is why I thought yoga. Everybody keeps talking about how good it is, and I've never done much. So you know what? Let me try it. I've done Pilates a lot. I've done fitness a lot. Let me try the other sort of thing in fitness. And I realized real fast, there's a reason that I didn't do it before. My brain was telling me not to do that.
Don't do this.
It's not
this is
for
not
me.
For you.
Yes, not for me, for other people. So I said, okay. Now I know, and it's been, like I say, it's been well over a year that I'm still, getting it under control. But again, it also shows that we're human.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're all human, and I'm in my early 50s, and you know what? My body doesn't respond like it did when it was in its early 30s. I wish it did.
Yep.
And that's something else we have to think about, because when we're talking about these tissues, not only is it laying down more fascia, but we also have a natural dehydration as we get older. We have less of those hydration molecules, the glycosaminoglycans and things like that, that aren't as prolific, in that area. So now we're not getting that hydration, and you're laying down more fascia, like throwing extra rebar into concrete, making it even stronger.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's like, okay, you put a lot more rebar in that concrete. Now make it move.
Right.
You want me to
It's
do
like,
what?
really? You want to do what? Say what?
Exactly. It can be done, but it just takes time. And it takes time for those spasms to ease up. And that's why when I've had clients before tell me, that their doctor will prescribe, muscle relaxants or anti-inflammatories, and they'll say, well, I take it when it hurts. I was like, okay, what was prescribed to you though? Did the doctor say to take your anti-inflammatories for a period of time? Because sometimes you just need to break the cycle. And the same thing with muscle spasms. Sometimes you just need to break that cycle. And sometimes it's good to listen to the doctor and take the medication for a period of time, like an antibiotic, I sometimes find. You don't want to just take it for a couple days, you feel a little bit better and forget about it. Sometimes you really need to break the cycle. So listen to the doctor if they really say, do this for a short term for 2 weeks or a month or whatever it is. Okay, listen to the doctor. See if you can get the inflammation to come down. See if you can get your body to start moving better and get out of pain, because then you're going to make better progress.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Because it's breaking the cycle is part of the thing. Right.
Yeah.
And we have our job in terms of breaking the cycle. And I would say a lot of our job in terms of breaking the cycle is, number one, not recreating the cycle.
Yes.
Right. Not irritating something as best we can. And any of you out there who are trainers know that your fantasy is that you will never, ever cause somebody trouble, right? You will never make somebody hurt more than when they came in.
Yeah.
And you all know, if you've been doing this any period of time, that every now and then you are going to do something that is more than that body can handle at that time. And they're going to come back the next day or the next week and go, wow, after that I was really sore because of blah, blah, blah.
Yep.
So just know that that's the nature of it. And all you can hope to do is get better at determining when you can push and when you can't push.
Yes.
And that's time and experience. And even then, I was just talking to a good friend of mine who had the classic experience of doing something really, really normal, really ordinary progression in terms of a shoulder program. And the client came in the next day and was in like excruciating pain. And really, from anything I'd ever experienced, there was no reason why that should have happened.
Yeah.
At all. So, the body's a mystery. Every now and then it'll do both good and bad things for you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And a lot of it does come down to intuition. And what I've discovered over the years, and you and I have been at this just about the same amount of time, less is more.
Generally, yes.
Generally. I think about, I want to progress them quickly, but then I take a step back and I just do a little bit less.
Yep.
And sometimes just doing 10 minutes instead of 15 minutes of that body part, it's like, okay, you're feeling good. Everything's good. Let's move on. Let's do something else and just let that. You've worked on strengthening it. We've worked on motion. We've worked on, mobility, everything that we need to. Now let's move on. Let's do something else rather than we're going to pummel this for the next 45 minutes and have them be so sore the next day that they, don't want to come back, but that they can barely move. I'm just finding more and more when I work with clients, do just a little bit less.
When you feel like you want to add that one thing, don't.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. A lot of times I say, like, especially with my clients who are in pain or really working with something, I limit myself to one new exercise a session at the most. Right. It's like really once it takes a while to get a program going, right? Because I've got to get the program going and get them up and running on enough things. But once I've got a program that's working for them, then I'll say, let's stick with this program, little tiny variations here and there, but nothing major. And then I'll add one thing. And then I want to see how they respond to that one thing. Next time that went well, great. I'm going to continue with that for another session. Then I might add one more thing. As a new trainer, I wanted to add 5 new things every time, right? Because again, I'm excited about what I'm learning, and I think they should be too. And so I want to give them a million things. And I really learned quickly, like, that doesn't work. Number one, I don't know what worked and what didn't.
Bingo.
Right? I don't have any feedback on what actually did make them better or made them worse. And I need to have that feedback.
Yep.
And I just, just too much input into the system is not always what the system can handle.
Yeah. When I was doing research at the University of Hawaii, we always looked at that. The scientific approach, you change one variable.
Yeah.
If you change more than one, you don't know which one caused or which one helped. And it's the same thing. If you're on a good track and things are moving in the right direction, add one thing at a time. Because if it works and things are getting better, cool, leave it in. If they go backwards, then you know what the one thing was, and you can just say, oh, okay, well, that range of motion didn't work, or that exercise didn't work. Okay, we're going to maybe, and how I always put it is, it's not necessarily that it was wrong. It may be wrong at that moment.
Yeah, exactly.
But a month from now, that might be the right exercise again. So it's just temporarily, you're not quite, and I don't try and put them down and say, well, you're not ready for that. I just say, you know what? We'll come back to that later. I have a better exercise. I always try and make it seem like, oh, check it out. I got this. This is so much better than even that one was. We'll come back to that later. This one's better for you. So they feel excited about, oh, okay, this one's an even better exercise, and you move forward with that. Well, in your brain, you're going, yeah, that was the wrong thing. Okay, wrong time. We'll come back to that in a month, 6 weeks or something, and try it again. You know, but I try and get their excitement up about something different and new at the same time.
Always. I always try to emphasize what they can do and how much fun it is to do this, rather than how bad it is that you can't do that.
Right.
And I particularly think of that with I know we did a session on this, but with my clients with osteoporosis, because they get really obsessed with all the things they can't do.
Sure.
And that can really just psychologically disturb them. So I'm like, no, let's not think about what you can't do. Let's not even think, I don't even mention that.
Yep.
Let's just do this now. And now we're going to do this now. And now we're going to do this now. And now we're going to do this now. Where I just give them that feeling like they can do a whole lot of stuff, and they don't notice that they're not doing any flexion, for example, or whatever.
Exactly. No, that's the way to make them feel good. That they want to come back, and it does change their way of thinking. The psychology of training, especially with rehabilitation, people are always looking at what they used to do and they can't do now. So they get fixated on that. And sometimes you have to remind them, especially when I have someone who's had back surgery or replacement of some sort, and they're like, well, I can't do this. And I'll say, nope, but look at what you can do. Before the surgery, you couldn't walk upstairs. Look at that. You're walking up the stairs, look real well now. Oh, well, I should be able to. Yeah, but you couldn't before, and you can now. Focus on what you can do. And that makes them go, oh, yeah, I guess I can. Focusing on that and say, you'll get back to the other thing eventually. And if you can't, you know what? So you can't swim a mile anymore. Okay, but can you go in the pool with your grandkids and have fun? Good. All right. What can you do? So I love that approach. I love that approach. So that's back spasms.
Yeah, and that gets us back to the troublesome triad a bit, what you were just saying, which is this progressive approach. And how do we practically work with a client? We mentioned a couple things just strategically, but let's kind of go through some of how we would work with.
Well, let's talk about the piriformis now. Yeah, let's break down the piriformis, because we've done the other two. We've done the the QL, we've done the psoas or iliopsoas. So we've got those two. But I find with a lot of clients who have had, that sciatic pain down their leg, numbness, tingling, radiating pain down their leg, a lot of it usually comes back to their glutes, their psoas especially. And that's why the psoas is part of this troublesome triad.
Yeah. So with the piriformis, looking at where that is, or the piriformis goes from the sacrum to the greater trochanter. Right, the top of the greater trochanter, inside of the sacrum, the top of the greater trochanter. Just get that anatomy going there. It's an external rotator, it's an abductor, and it's a hip extensor. So it'll bring your leg back behind you, out to the side, and externally rotate it. So, which is funny because that's not really why it causes trouble. Right, because unless you're a dancer, which some people are, but a lot of people don't spend a lot of time in external rotation. So talking through that, the piriformis, and this is how I talked a little bit about the other parts of the troublesome triad, is I think of it as trying to stabilize the hip, because evolutionarily it was in a role where it could stabilize the hip. Now it's not really in a role where it can stabilize the hip, but it keep's trying.
Explain that. And I feel like evolutionarily.
Okay, so if you are standing up, right, and you think about, if you guys are out there following this, find your sacrum, like at the edge of your sacrum, base of your spine, and you go over and then feel that greater trochanter, that pokey outy part of your femur. Okay, so that's like the line that it makes, and it really is going to attach to the top of that greater trochanter. So in standing up, there's some tone there, right, just to kind of hold that leg in place. Now, if I was a quadruped, and I think of a lot of these muscles as acting differently when we got upright. If I'm a quadruped, now instead of that muscle being essentially behind us, that muscle is going from the sacrum, which is now on the top of the body, right? Because our sacrum is now basically facing the ceiling. And that piriformis is going across the back of the pelvis to attach to the top of the greater trochanter, the femur. So it's really holding, if you think about it that way, it's holding that femur into the acetabulum, is one way to think about it. And if I was walking like a quadruped, right, if you imagine that you're crawling around on the ground, right, and my femur is going a little forward and a little back, and a little forward and a little back, it's stabilizing it within that small range of motion, starting from neutral being hip flexion. Right? So if you're quadruped, neutral is hip flexion to roughly 90 degrees. You go a little forward, you go a little back, and that creates mobility.
And I like the way that you put that, because when we talk about hip stability, the piriformis is always listed. And I think possibly because it is one of the troublesome ones, but also because it's one of the larger muscles when we think of the external rotators of the hip, or the 6 deep rotators, because it does fan out quite a bit. I mean, everybody feel your sacrum, how broad that is. It's pretty broad, especially if you're a taller guy like I am. So it fans out that whole section because it attaches on the anterior portion of that. So it's pretty broad, and then comes more to a narrower end into the greater trochanter. So you think of it, it's a big muscle. But where it does attach to us when we're in standing position, it really almost lifts the femur up as it rotates it out. You know, it does. That's why it does abduction. It takes the leg out to the side. Whereas when, like you said, you go into a quadruped, and now it's pulling it directly into the socket. So that's an interesting way for us to look at, you know, why is it so big? It was very important when we were more in a bent over position.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So hopefully that made sense. I know it's hard to do this without visuals, but hopefully some of that made sense, because it's always, I think, a little tricky to describe this, especially without, you know, again, good visuals. So take a moment. So for me, when I think about that, that tells me somewhat neurologically how the piriformis is modeled in the brain, if that gets a little fancy there. But basically, I feel like the body goes, I want hip stability. Oh, tell the piriformis what to do. And if the hip is unstable, and I think about a lot of my dancers, I also think a lot about my clients who run, and who basically haven't run for a while and then suddenly get back to running, and they come in and they're like, oh my God, my butt is killing me because that piriformis is in spasm. Like, its job will be to try to stabilize that hip socket. Right. And again, it's not really designed well to do that. So talking about who actually does that, it's a lot of the other deep rotators of the hip. So particularly, according to some research, the quadratus femoris, which I'm sure some of you guys are like, what are you talking about? It's a little tiny muscle that goes more or less from just near your sit bone straight across to the greater trochanter, the back of the greater trochanter and low. So it really can genuinely pull that femur into the socket.
In a standing position.
In a standing position, yes, exactly, and stabilize it there. It's not a muscle we think about. It's not a muscle we train a lot. And it's a really important one for actually creating hip stability, as opposed to the piriformis, which is doing its best, but is really not designed for it. Also, obturator internus and externus can have some role there too in terms of hip stability.
That I found that muscle, when I try to, first of all, explain it to clients, that especially those who we have a lot of clients who have labral issues in the hip. And a lot of times even though it's wrapped up, the joint capsule is wrapped and encased by ligament. And I've heard a lot of people, anatomists, basically say there's no movement within the socket. What do you mean it's moving forward and it's moving back? It just rotates. But I find that there is play anterior, posterior. So it moves a little bit. And if we spend so much time in hip flexion, that can actually let that femoral head ride forward in the acetabulum, and it's going to continue to pinch off right where a lot of people have, more of an anterior or a superior anterior tear in their labrum if they have a labral issue.
Or bursitis. Right. Also, just any of those, or anterior hip tendonitis, any of those things.
Right. And when we begin to train the quadratus femoris in stability and to be able to get it active, recruit it again, get it activated, suddenly they're like, oh, I feel better. My hip doesn't hurt nearly as much. And we can see that we can pull that, femoral head back slightly in the joint. Now, what muscle actions do the quadratus femoris do?
So it's a external rotator and an adductor.
Okay, so almost exact opposite of the piriformis in that the piriformis wants to do abduction. This does adduction. It pulls it in. Right.
And it's really right at the place to do that. So if you guys want to get out your anatomy atlases and take a look, feel free. But basically, its job is just to bring that femur into the socket and give it some more stability there. So one of the things that I work on in terms of training, so a lot of times when people talk about training this area, they're constantly doing things like clamshells, right? Clamshells are kind of the thing.
Yep.
And clamshells are fine. Clamshells are going to work more directly the piriformis.
Right.
Right? External rotation and abduction, basically, right? Which is great. But what I find is not addressed typically is this quadratus femoris.
Yeah.
And I actually address this by doing a couple of things. One, I want to stimulate the hip, the femur, to really move into the acetabulum, not out of the acetabulum. Okay. And that's an image, guys. There's not a lot of motion there, but that idea of you're like sucking it in. And one thing that I find for the quadratus femoris is, let's say I'm doing adduction work, right? I've got like a ball between the knees, or I've got something between the legs, or a ring if you're in Pilates land and you're squeezing that ring. If you're squeezing that item above your knees, all right, and you're like squeezing against something, but you're squeezing against something at the end of your femur. This again is an image, but I feel like almost like it opens up or widens or pulls that femur slightly away from the acetabulum.
Exactly.
And that's a bit of an image. So a lot of times what I do is I take something very small, like a folded towel I'll use, or usually a folded towel works quite well, kind of a fat folded towel. I'll put it way up high, so it's really right at the bottom of the pelvis. And it's squeezing from there and squeezing with external rotation. And that I found directly gets that quadratus femoris to start to fire, takes the piriformis out of it because I'm not really abducting at all. I'm adducting, and I can get some strength and some tone in that area, which then can help to counteract the overactivity of the piriformis.
Next time you guys are out there doing any adductor work and putting something between your legs, test that out. I just had a class. It was a large class when I was in Korea, and one of the exercises I was teaching was with a ball between their knees. And I said, everybody just try this. And I asked them to do it. I said, first, between your knees, squeeze the ball. Everybody, okay. I said, now focus on your hips. What are you feeling? And you could see they were trying to feel. I said, now put it all the way by your pelvis, all the way up. And now squeeze. We were doing bridges. And now squeeze. How many of you actually feel as though you're pulling the femurs into the socket and every hand went up? And you could really see that it was like, oh, okay, this is different. Now, one of the things that I like to do for the quadratus femoris is I also add that external rotation. But again, thinking about it from, like you said, evolutionarily, I'm going to do it in a standing position. So I put them on a rotator disc. So I put them on 2 rotator discs, and I have a little round pillow, and I put it as far up their femurs as possible, right up against their pelvis. And I have them externally rotate as they're squeezing the pillow. And this is the other thing that I do, because naturally what they're going to want to do is squeeze their butt. So I tell them, put your hands on your butt. Put your hands on your butt. I don't want you to feel it squeeze. And again, this goes against everything a lot of times we're teaching is we want to get their glutes activated. I'm doing the opposite now. So I'm going to say, I want them just to remain flaccid. Relax, relax, relax your butt. Now, externally rotate and squeeze your femurs together. Squeeze your legs together. Relax your butt. And after about 3 or 4 repetitions, they get it. And you can see their eyes get really big and they're like, oh, they're feeling something different. And they're really in a standing position, pulling that in and pulling it directly into the hip socket. And I find that that gets it firing like nobody's business.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, I mean, this is, and again, so guys, what we're trying to do here is get an area activated that actually does the job that the muscle that's in spasm is trying to do.
Yeah.
Right? So basically, we're trying to create compensatory strength to take the load off the piriformis and put it really where it should be, which is at that quadratus femoris.
Yep.
One other way that I work with that, so I also don't always even add the external rotation. I find if I just am doing adduction work, like footwork on the reformer, for example, with, again, a towel or a small pillow up against the pelvis, that can get it as well. So I don't always need to be an external rotation, which is great, because that's where a lot of times I want to really develop that hip stability for running or walking, which is a more of a parallel experience. One other way that I do that, and any of you who've worked with me have seen this because I'm a bit of I have a thing about it, but basically is if you're doing standing work on the reformer, I do it on a moderate weight because I don't want this to be so loose that they've got to really work. Maybe a blue spring, maybe a red spring, probably a red spring. And I basically have them stand on the standing platform and stand on the carriage, which is normal. But now if I keep my feet flat and I push out, that also gives me that feeling of slight pressure outward at the top of the femur. If, on the other hand, I gently roll my feet in, so I basically take my first toe joint and roll it over the standing platform and off the standing platform and off of the carriage, and basically angle my feet so that the force is now going through my foot, directly through my femur into my hip socket at that angle, right? That also, that was the first time I did that a million years ago with a client who was having some hip issues. And that was like that same light bulb moment. It's like, oh, because I feel like that puts force directly into the femur, into the acetabulum, as opposed to out of the acetabulum. And that really helps to get it seated in there. And for many, many clients with hip issues, that is like just feels fantastic, takes the pressure off of the piriformis, and really helps to stabilize the femur.
I love that. That's a great one. And I've done that even on the Coraline or any of the types of things where you can let the feet just gently float in. If I don't have that option, what I sometimes will do is just have them think about pushing through the inner arch of the foot a little bit more. And neurologically, that can begin to stimulate a similar thing if they can't, completely turn their toes in.
Really bevel the foot. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because even just taking because sometimes I'll even do this standing or with even a little, what are they called? The little disc things, right? Just little moving disc things if somebody doesn't have any equipment at home or paper plate, basically, work with that, right? And just standing on one leg and just taking the other leg and pushing out with that big toe line. Right? Just pushing out and keeping that leg at that angle. And that just changes how that force moves up through the femur and into the acetabulum and really stimulates that stability a lot more.
Now, in this situation, we're talking about all closed chain activity. I find that trying to get this firing, closed chain works better, in my opinion.
Absolutely better.
Yeah, I find. Just in general, because it's functional. It's functional.
It's where you want it to work.
Yes.
You want it to work when you put that foot down on the ground and you shift your weight over that leg. That's when you want that hip stability. The other thing too is, this is a little bit one of my things, but if I'm really working at hip stability, I do not find that open chain gives me the results I want at all.
Yeah.
But it's great for mobility. It's great for stimulating the area. It's great for some general strengthening of all those muscles. There's a lot of wonderful things about open chain work. But if I'm really genuinely trying to get hip stability, closed chain is much more effective. I find training closed chain, my results are 5 times faster in terms of really creating that stability and creating that strength in a functional way.
Yep, I agree completely. Yeah. I've noticed that in general, whenever we're talking about functionality, getting them into a standing position is usually going to stimulate it a lot better. Now, again, activation, getting the area stronger initially where they may not be able to support their own body weight or be able to handle, just the complexity of a standing position. Some people, it takes some time. We need to wake the muscles up.
Yeah.
Side lying exercises like the clamshell and all of those are great to start with.
Yeah.
But you got to get them off the table. You can't be doing that forever.
Right. Yep.
So that's just, one of the things that I've noticed.
I mean, one of the things we were talking about, so now I'm going back to our original conversation, right? With the piriformis, if I have to really decrease, and get that muscle dynamically moving without much load, closed chain's not going to do it.
Right.
It's just going to be too stressful, because with closed chain, generally I've got a certain amount of weight or resistance from somewhere.
Yep.
So that's where I do start with more of an open chain situation, feet in straps or something else where I'm really supporting the leg to do the work that it's going to do. And I slowly build up the strength in more of an open chain position and the range of motion. And then I work gently and slowly into some closed chain work.
And something to think about, we talked about the clamshell, which I like the exercise. I use it on a lot of clients, especially when they're fresh out of surgery and whatnot, because you need to activate the muscle, get it stronger before you get into a standing position. But one thing that I do notice is that certain times, certain positions will bother the muscle. So if it's at 45 degrees from the hips, for instance, that may bother it. But if you take it up to 60 degrees from the hips, it may not. Or back it down to 30 degrees. So the position of the leg can make a huge difference. And it also strengthens the muscle a little bit differently every angle that you put it through.
I mess with that all the time.
Yeah.
So if somebody's doing a sideline clamshell, like I'll start actually with the heel of the top leg, right? Because that's going to be the turning out leg, like basically kind of a little above the ankle bone. Right, so the knee's a little bit bent, but it's not massively bent, and do it from there. Then take it like halfway up the shin, right? So I'm halfway between the ankle and the knee. Then I might be up closer to the knee. Then, right, so it's like moving it up. And each of those angles, if you guys try this, if you ever done this, feels completely different.
Completely different.
You really are getting absolutely different angles of all of those hip external rotators.
Right.
And you're getting different stimulation into the joint. It really varies wildly through that whole range. And I like to work the whole range because, that the leg works in all those ranges. It doesn't just work in one angle.
Yep. And a good progression from there, from what I find, is what I call an open clamshell, where I'll actually take the foot off of the other foot or the leg, suspend it in midair, but continue to do external rotation. I'm not just doing abduction. I'm still rotating the femur.
Yep.
But I don't have the support of the foot, so now I have to hold it up in midair, which makes it a lot more challenging. And that usually turns the volume up and the intensity up quite a bit. But again, it's a good progression from sort of the beginner to intermediate before you take them into a standing position.
One other thing I'll sometimes do there, if you've got a wall, which not everybody has an available wall, but what happens typically, right, is when somebody externally rotates, they just roll their hip back. Right, all the time, which is normal. So if I've got a wall, I'll put them up against a wall. So I'll line them up so that their hips, both cheeks are against a wall. Their shoulders are maybe against that wall, and then I'll have them do that from there. So they're really keeping the pelvis stable while they move the hip, and that changes things also quite radically. Because even that little bit of roll back makes it a whole lot easier.
Well, that's one of my pet peeves about people coming from physical therapy. And I'm not saying that the physical therapists teach them how to do it. I think everybody makes the exercises their own in some way, shape, or form. And almost everybody comes to me and they're leading it with their pelvis. Their pelvis is rolling backwards. And the one thing I tighten up everybody on is I say, lean the hips slightly forward. I say, okay, how I do it is I'll put their feet on top of each other, usually 45 degrees from the hips is where I often start. And I'll say, look down at your knees. Do you see how they're in line with each other? Say yes. Now roll your hips forward so that the top knee looks like it's slightly in front of the bottom knee.
Nice.
And when they see that, they have the visual cue. So now they can take that home with them because they have a visual. It's not just feeling. Unfortunately, not everybody's body aware. So they can have that visual cue and they say, oh, yeah. And I say, now that's where you start. And, well, I can't go as high. That's okay. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I want you just to do, and then they say, oh my gosh, do I feel that 10 times more?
Exactly. It's much more fatiguing.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, much more fatiguing.
Yep. And so again, not to say they weren't taught correctly the first time, they've just made the exercise their own. You know?
Nice.
And I love what you had said about starting them off as light as possible. For a lot of people, even people coming to me from physical therapy, a side clam may be too difficult for them to do, especially after a hip replacement.
Yes.
So doing it like you had suggested, what I call a supine clam, having them lie on their back and open their knees, even with no resistance and gravity assisting them, can work that range of motion. And then eventually using the lightest band possible. And how I like to do it is, I know it's mostly taught both legs at the same time. I prefer one leg at a time in that position.
Yeah,
because,
me too. I do a lot of that.
Yeah, one is stabilizing while one is mobile.
Yes. Yep.
So it's getting both legs, but for different things, different reasons.
Yes. And both are necessary.
Absolutely.
If you're rehabbing a hip replacement, you need stability on both hips. Right?
Absolutely.
Both the one that had surgery and the one that's now going to have to support the one that had surgery for an extended period of time until it gets up to snuff.
Absolutely. And something that you had said earlier that I think I kind of want to bring this around to all three muscles, the whole triad, is when we're working with people who have issues with these areas. Okay. I think let's look at a progression. Let's look at a typical progression, whether they're working their hip flexor, their quadratus lumborum, or their piriformis. I think, like we were just talking, trying to find a position where gravity is assisting us may be the easiest way to get that range of motion firing. So they're working actively, not just stretching, but actively working that range of motion under light resistance.
Or assistance. Right, like for example, with the hip flexor, with the psoas, I'll start just lying supine. Ideally, the easiest way to do this, the absolute beginner way, is lying supine with your knees at a right angle and your feet on the wall, or a whatever, your form or whatever, and basically just bringing the knees into the chest from there. So gravity is assisting the hip flexion at that point. And honestly, with a lot of psoas stuff, I have to start there.
Yeah.
I have to start with just like little marches, not even going past 90 degrees. So that's why the feet are on the wall or on the foot bar or on the edge of something, and just bringing that in to get just that upper range of the psoas working, because that's often what is the most fibrous, the weakest, the least active is that upper range, and really just getting that moving, and then slowly moving them away from the wall, getting it a little bit bigger range, or slowly adding, a tiny bit of resistance, a band, for example, or even an ankle weight or a knee weight, something like that, just to have a little bit more resistance coming in and coming out. Or a strap if you've got, like a spring if you're on the trap table, that kind of thing. Or, so I'm going one more thing in terms of the Pilates universe is seated footwork on the chair, seated leg pumps on the chair, right? Because there the pedal is assisting that high range. And because of the height of the chair, for most people, when that pedal's all the way up, they're in pretty deep hip flexion.
Oh, yeah.
So that's another way, again, that's going to assist them into that hip flexion.
Something that I've done, the machine I have is the shuttle MVP, which is very, very similar to the reformer in that you're in a lying down position. It imitates a squat a lot more than a traditional leg press machine might. And what I like to do on that or on the reformer is begin by putting a decent amount of resistance on there. So they're pushing out, they're getting their hips engaged, they're getting their glutes, all of that fine. But on the way back down, I get them to think about bringing your knees in towards your chest. So they're being pushed down. The weight is actually pushing them into hip flexion. But I'm just starting to remind the muscle to go into that hip flexion, and then I lighten the weight. And as soon as I lighten the weight, they say, well, I can do more weight than that. I say, oh, different reason here. Different reason. So I may go from having them do 2 reds and a blue to suddenly do 2 reds and then a red and a blue. Then 1 red, and so that it's really light, and they're thinking I'm almost like I'm pulling myself down. I'm like, yes, exactly. So they're getting, it's a progressive way to get resistance, but still less than your body weight.
Right. Now the reformer, because we have the shoulder rests, they can be kneeling with their knees against the shoulder rest or hands on the frame of the reformer.
Yeah.
And you can start with a yellow spring.
Yes.
Right? You can start with a yellow spring and then go to a blue and then go to a red and slowly build up the strength in that flexion above 90.
Right.
And that, again, that's another, a lot like we talked about with the piriformis. When that gets stronger, so many things get better.
Yep.
when that upper range of the psoas is strengthened, it stabilizes the spine, it balances the forces out through the spine, it helps the hips feel more comfortable.
Yep.
The low back feels more comfortable. Again, but you've got to be progressive. You've got to be slow and progressive.
Yeah. And starting with, like we said, something that almost has no resistance. So they're working in active range of motion, and slowly begin to add a little bit of resistance slowly in time. The tendency is people are going to want to rush this because they feel like they can do more. They feel like they can handle more weight. And what I remind people is the stabilizing muscles oftentimes are the weaker, and that the outside muscles are going to try and take over. So if I'm lying down with a big thick band around my knees and I'm trying to do abduction, that supine clam, well, guess what? My glutes are going to try and get involved as well.
Glute max is going to go, this is my job.
Bingo.
Because the piriformis have essentially the same job.
Right.
So it can definitely go like, oh, well, I'm not going to have you work. I'm going to do it, right? Bingo. It's my job.
But if you go light and start working it and really almost make the glute max say, oh, that's too light. What do you need me for?
Yes, exactly.
So the piriformis starts to do the job and is reminded, oh yeah, I'm supposed to help out with this. I'm supposed to do this too. So starting out unweighted, less weight, or de-weight them. Like I say, on the reformer, you can take them in a squat position, you reduce the weight so that they're pulling their knees in. Both of those work from a squatted position. And eventually I'll take them into more of a resisted position. And we've talked about that for the hip flexor, even just doing standing marching.
Yep.
So you have a full range of motion. I find standing marching is a lot easier than seated marching because you have that full range of motion. Where you do it seated, you're limiting the range of motion really to just that above 90 position. So it becomes a lot more challenging.
Yeah, but also focuses more specifically on the iliopsoas.
Absolutely.
Because that's what's going to help you in that above 90 position.
Exactly. Yeah, so I find having that progression is really important, not trying to overdo it. Because overdoing it means all these other muscles are going to try and help out. And they're going to take over.
It also, if it's prone to spasm, like you don't know when things are warm, with a muscle that is prone to spasming, when it's warm, when its circulation is good because it's just worked, it's pretty happy.
Yeah.
When it decides like the next day or later that day or after they've driven home, that's when it's going to talk to you. Is once that circulation calms down and it cools down, that's when you're going to get the reaction. You don't know at the time how much muscle that muscle can actually take until it's actually calmed down and it's cooled down and it's relaxed. Then you actually know whether you succeeded or not.
So in this situation, that less is more environment really, and tell the client that it's okay that they're doing less, and it's a mindset that, I don't know about, but for me, my clients always want to do a bigger range of motion. They always want to do more weight. They always want to do more resistance. It's like more is always better in their mind, and sometimes it's like, no, relax. We're doing it for a different reason. So if I am having them do, like I say, a leg press and I want to get more deep hip flexion, that's when I will reduce the weight a little bit and say, just focus on the knees coming up, focus on the knees coming in toward the chest. And when they're doing that, they're like, oh, that feels different. I say, good. And keep reducing the weight until they're doing closer to their body weight. They say, oh, wow, this feels really different. We can get very dynamic with that muscle. For the psoas, an exercise that I love to do is I use a Viper, sometimes I use a dumbbell, and I say, put it on the top shelf. So I put it against my thighs while I'm holding with my hands, and I will say, now I want you in a quick motion. Now this is a progression that is toward, the end when they've developed a lot of strength or some strength, and I'll have them sort of drive it up with their leg as though their arm isn't doing nearly as much work, and then put it up onto a shelf. If it's a dumbbell, that's against my thigh, and I'm lifting it up and making my leg try and put it on the shelf.
So starting in a squat.
No. Starting standing.
No. Oh, okay.
Starting standing. So a lot of times I'll have them do it with the Viper or a foam roller first. So it's pushing against that and literally lifting it up and then put it on the shelf, bring it back down, lifting it up, using that leg drive to really try and lift that. So it gets that power, you know, and I'll do it with dumbbells. Sometimes, like I said, do it with a Viper, whatever I have available. And I find that gets it more into that dynamic sense. And these are clients who want to get back to running, who want to get back to cycling, and need to, in a vigorous way, lift that knee in order to complete the cycling, you know, the full circle in a cycle. Or if they're running and they want to pick up their speed a little bit, they need to start bringing that knee in toward the chest. So again, this is toward this is not at the beginning. This is toward the end of that progression, but trying to get them more dynamic is my goal.
Nice. So they basically they'll lift the leg up and lift the Viper up with their leg. So I was missing the picture. Now I got the full picture. Great. Got it. Fabulous.
So again, just trying to take it to that next level. So, you know, starting it out very easy, but eventually we're going to work to more dynamic. We're not staying at that super simple. We're going to progress them somewhere over 6 weeks, 6 months, whatever it takes.
Nice. And then we're talking about the quadratus lumborum. It gets trickier because that's all, like for that, it's all about lateral flexion.
Yes.
For me, you know, and hip hikes and that kind of thing. And the challenge for me with the quadratus lumborum is a lot of the movements that are necessary to strengthen the quadratus lumborum dynamically are also the movements that can cause low back spasms.
Yeah.
Right. They're like, there's a real tricky spot there that I have to walk, you know, all the time.
Well, we talked about that before about the hip hikes. I consider that an exercise I hate because it's the weight of my leg is pretty heavy.
It's a lot. It's a lot.
It's a lot. So by having them do that, and if they are prone to any SI joint dysfunction or any upslip, it's immediately going to want to spasm.
Yep.
You know, whereas I'd much rather put them on a ball and have them do hip shift side to side, just gentle, or hula going around in circles. And I almost don't want them focusing on just the quadratus lumborum. I kind of want that to help out in those motions.
Right. Yes.
Rather than have them go to the side so quickly that muscle says, I got this, and really clamp down.
Right. So this is a different strategy than we talked about with the piriformis or the psoas. And a lot of this is really involving the whole system.
Yes.
So our abdominals are working, right? Our obliques are working, our abductors may be working, right? All those pieces are part of it, trying to, again, what is the QL trying to do? It's trying to, I think of it as stabilizing and organizing the rib cage, the spine, and the pelvis, right? That's kind of that role it plays. And it's not the only thing that does that, right? Our whole thoracolumbar fascia, our abdominals, like there's a lot of things playing that role. So I think you're right. I think here it's more like how do we just get the rhythm going? Like even just a simple little hip shift on the ball, or even just a hip shift, even just seated, just like moving from side to side. And because I find this area is so irritable often and so excitable often that I've got to start that small. I've got to start just really small and let them really explore how far can I go before they feel like it's going to grab, because if they go out of range, it's going to grab. I do a lot of supported side sit-up work as things progress, and it may be, maybe over the Pilates arc or the step barrel. So they've got support under the underside, and they're basically just coming up with the top side. So one side is supported, or I may put, if you don't have that, I'll put a bolster underneath there, or a pillow, or a ball, all kinds of things. So they're pushing up into it, but they have some stability on one side, and they can kind of keep the pelvis and the rib cage organized, and then just work the other side. The mermaid on the reformer is a classic and a very simple. The thing about the mermaid on the reformer is it's very light. Really, it's a very light side bend, and it's a very supported side bend because your hand is on the foot bar and your other hand is doing whatever it's doing. I find that's oftentimes my easiest place to start.
Sure. For me, I've found that this gets that muscle very well, and it's one that I don't think people think about. I have them take a medicine ball. Usually I start out with a 2-pound medicine ball. What I like are the larger medicine balls that are very lightweight. okay, Dynamax or whatever. So they're 16 inches or so, but they're very light. And you can work up to 8 pounds or whatever your body wants. But have them walk, and as they're walking, almost do a figure 8. So I'm going to bring it toward my hip, bring it up, around, like an infinity sign, basically down toward my hip, and then up in front of my body, down towards the other hip, and up. It's getting a little bit of lateral flexion as I'm walking, because my hips are also going to be working. You know, the pelvis,
dynamic load for sure.
It's got that dynamic load, and again, start with 2 pounds, so it's lightweight. It's not that much. And then go up to 4 pounds, 6 pounds, whatever, you know, eventually. And I find it's a way to sneak up, and it's working the entire core.
Yeah, I love that.
And sometimes I'll even get the Viper, which is a long tube with 2 handles. And I'll say, like, you're rowing a kayak.
Yeah, that's what it was like kayak rowing to me. I was thinking, I'll just row a kayak.
It's like doing a kayak. It's side to side. And you can do that with start out again with the lightest, you know, one, and work your way up. But it gets that QL in a dynamic function. Yeah. But you're also getting your core, you're getting everything involved to help out. So you're really organizing in a way that, let's face it, the quadratus lumborum rarely works 100% by itself like a bicep curl would. It's usually in conjunction with a lot. It's part of a system.
Yeah. It's part of a system. It has to be. You can't work it alone.
Right. Yeah. And you want that organization. You want that coordination.
Yes.
We need that. So I say train it like that.
That's beautiful. I love that. So systematic work. One thing I would just, that's fabulous. I love that. I'm going to steal that immediately. Those guys in the Pilates space, what I might suggest for you guys is just taking a foam roller, which is lighter than Brian's saying. And I can use that, and I could put a little ankle weight around that, right? I'm just thinking of tools that we tend to have, and you can do that same idea. I love that.
You could also use the ring, the Pilates ring.
Yeah.
It's not weighted, but you can actually, by pushing in a little bit, you can get a little bit core activation with that as well, I find.
Nice. But the other thing too, and this is what I want to focus on here, is the other side of that. That's working very functionally, and in a range, it's very functional. Yeah, it's going to be a small range of motion in terms of concentric and eccentric, right? Just a little bit of a do adjusting, but also having to realistically adjust to the rotation of the torso, the movement of the pelvis, all that stuff. One of the things that I like to play with too is when it's appropriate to work that in a full range. Right. So that's the other thing, is to try to get a full side bend as far as they can, laterally flex in one direction and back up. So we're also working that through its full dynamic range with strength. And that's right. Use the balls and other kinds of things to slowly build up to full dynamic action of that muscle. But I love the functional training as well. Yeah. Fantastic.
Cool. Well, guys, that is a terrible triad.
Yeah.
Or troublesome triad.
Troublesome, terrible. It's a problem. It's our problem child.
Yes,
one of our problem children.
And what I find is almost everybody who has had low back pain or any pain in that area, it's one of those 3, if not multiple of those.
Yep. Or they chase each other. Yes. It's my QL. No, it's my psoas. No, it's my piriformis. Exactly. Oh, it's my QL. Right. One or the other of those is going to be a problem. And we said this at the very beginning, the beginning of last time, is if you can release these, if you can get some of this spasm releasing in one of these areas, if one of these areas is a problem, that will often decrease their symptoms dramatically. So regardless of what the pathology is underlying it, they will feel better, which is really the point, and be a little bit more functional. So these are key to anybody with low back pain, these 3.
That's awesome. Well, thank you guys for joining us. Hopefully you learned a lot. I mean, we throw a lot of information at you, especially when it comes to 2-part episodes like this. There's a lot of stuff. Listen to it. I mean, a lot of times I've gone over podcasts again and again, and each time I listen, I get a little bit more information. So please re-listen to it, play with some of the exercises, pick what works for you, throw away what doesn't, sort of thing. And hopefully we ignited a little bit of thought of these 3 areas, and I didn't think about it that way. So hopefully we throw some of these thought bombs at you that make you think, okay, I understand this a little bit more. Or you may question and want to go and start doing a little bit more research to answer your own questions.
Awesome. That's our plan. Planting the seeds so your brains can go wherever they need to go for you and your clients to make them better, healthier, and happier.
Absolutely. And again, our social media is going to be at Moving Convos, Instagram, Twitter. You can reach us at movingconvos@gmail.com. And for Nora St. John, I'm Brian Ritchie. We will see you next week.
Bye, guys.